Michal has a foot in many camps, both legal, academic, and now, happily, I think, in the political camp with experience in North America, and certainly knowing Israel inside out. So she's very well equipped to handle the topic of this evening, Israel World Jewry and the fight against anti-Semitism. We look forward very much to your comments, Michal. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for having me, and Shana Tova to everybody who we have on the Zoom call with us. I appreciate so much that you're taking the time to engage in discussion, and I wish it was much more of a discussion. Of course, I wish I could be there in person, among others, to see our family members who live in Sydney, the Gavshans and the Wunsches, who we miss terribly. And at these times, actually, the world just seems that much larger. So thank you all for being with us tonight, and thank you to AJAC for organizing this opportunity. I think that the thread that connects all three issues, and I really appreciate the way that you wound them up together. And maybe I'll begin unwrapping them one at a time, but I think that the thread that wraps them all together is actually the imperative for us to be doing exactly what we're doing now. I wish it wasn't on Zoom, but it is the engagement that is an imperative in order for us to be able to together combat the various manifestations, which we will discuss, but the various manifestations of what challenges not only Israel, but world Jewry, and really what challenges us together, both as a people bound together in terms of Jewish peoplehood and in terms of our role internationally and our standing, or Israel standing, in the international arena. And I'll say, as it paves the path forward for others to engage with us. I don't think that we need to do this alone. And so maybe I'll begin actually by the most recent appointment, and that is the Knesset's representative with regards to the ICC issue. I mean, obviously I don't have standing in the ICC, but in fact, the Knesset has thus far not engaged with the challenges that Israel faces from the ICC as a general symptom of what happens in the international arena, I would say, in terms of engaging in what I call the language of rights, the lingua franca spoken by the rest of the world. And I think that the institutions such as the ICC are an imperative to engage with, not only because of the double standard, which we'll elaborate a little bit more on, but because they in fact undermine the very mandate of institutions such as the ICC to be there as trustees of international law, of human rights, in order to protect the peoples and the communities that need that help. And so I think that the imperative for Israel's Knesset to both be familiar with this language that I'm using, and I don't mean English, and engage with interparliamentary, with our fellow parliamentarians throughout the world, both in the specific context of the ICC decision, which we are awaiting. And for those that might not be aware, maybe I'll just say a word about that. There is a decision that the ICC is about to render. We don't know if it's days, weeks, we've been awaiting it, with regards to their very mandate to try, I mean, the implications will be to try Israeli soldiers for crimes against humanity committed during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. So the importance of understanding this, and I believe, and many of you probably know, that Australia even made a submission with regard to this. The importance to understand is that the state of Palestine, not recognized as a state in any other context, but in this one, is able to make its allegations against the state of Israel. And the fact that the ICC, and we'll see what the decision will be, would ignore submissions such as Australia's, those have very, I would say, tremendous relevance, not only for Israel, but for the rest of the world. If Australia's submission is ignored, or Canada's submission is ignored, and if violations of international treaties, including the Oslo Accords, by the way, by the Palestinians, are ignored by the very fact that they've received standing at the ICC and made these allegations at the ICC, and if the double standard is applied, that it then enables the court, I mean, there are so many levels here, that enables the court to investigate Israeli soldiers and officers during Operation Protective Edge for crimes against humanity, which the state of Israel did not commit. 1 week after, the same ICC actually published, of course, with a lot less noise around it, published a 10-year-long awaited decision with regard to what happened on the Mavi Marmara in 2010. And in that decision, actually acknowledges that they don't have the ability to investigate because there is no standing in front of the court. If that's going to happen, then the ramifications are tremendous, really not only to Israel, certainly not to the Jewish communities abroad singularly, but to the whole world at large that relies on the ICC as trustees of international law, as trustees of human rights, to uphold, protect, and promote the law, to uphold, promote, and protect human rights of all. So if we undermine and apply, if we, apply a double standard with regard to Israel, the ramifications are that we undermine the entire infrastructure upon which the ICC is based. A little bit about the Knesset's decision to appoint me, and I think that it's a two-way decision. One is, as I said, the importance of engaging with parliamentarians throughout the world, whether it's in Europe, and there are, I don't know if everybody's familiar, but parliaments have many interparliamentary engagements, very many opportunities, both formal and informal. So we have friendship circles with every single country, and we also have more formal organizations that are actually parliaments of parliaments, the IPU. There are many, many opportunities for us to engage with parliamentarians. That's one aspect of it. And for that to happen, I believe that Israel has to be there engaged in the discussion, using the language of rights, utilizing our abilities to understand international law as a country that both respects, upholds, and promotes international law, but doesn't always utilize it in order to rise from the docket of the accused. That's one side of it. The other side of it is actually internal with regard to the Knesset itself. It's very important to me, and it's actually part of my mission statement in being here at the moment, to make this accessible to all members of Knesset. I think that when we sit around the table and make very important decisions that affect not only the state of Israel and not only Jewish communities around the world, but Israel's standing in the international arena, we have a real hold on these challenges. These challenges affect the perspective that we should have when we make those decisions. And unless we engage and acknowledge the existence of these challenges and understand them, we can't make informed decisions as far as I'm concerned. So that's the other sort of side of it, internal to the Knesset, that I see of great importance. And I'm very grateful to the Knesset speaker, to Yariv Levin, for acknowledging the importance specifically now. I believe that this is a strategic threat on the state of Israel. But beyond that, also, as I said, undermines the possibility of being able to utilize the ICC for the benefit of other populations around the world. That's about the ICC. You mentioned in the introduction the subcommittee on diaspora affairs, or on Israel diaspora relations. I think that, first of all, it's inextricably linked to where I began. The inextricable link for me, or at least in my mind, is the imperative to engage with communities around the world in a very different way than we have engaged in Israel's 72 years of existence. The miracle that is the state of Israel is founded on a very certain paradigm of our relationship, meaning Israel diaspora relations have been very singularly defined by the need to create a viable state of Israel that can survive under, and that doesn't mean that this is all still, it's still all relevant, a viable state of Israel in secure borders that must be able to protect itself and defend itself. That is true. And whilst that is true, there are vibrant communities around the world that have a whole set of other challenges that Israel can and should be familiar with, acknowledge, and engage with. And in that sense, possibly even flip the equation in terms of who reaches out to help whom. And I don't just mean financially at all. I think that the first step in this different kind of engagement is the acknowledgement of the difference in challenges that we face, is the understanding that these challenges are very, very real to different communities all over the world, and the imperative for the state of Israel to know them, to become familiar with them, to hear them. And I think that coronavirus, and I say this in all different contexts, coronavirus actually brings with it a lot of opportunities alongside the challenges. This may be one of the most fundamental opportunities as far as Jewish peoplehood is concerned. I think that no, or at least in my lifetime, do I remember no other time that is so evident that what binds us together, what unites us, is so much greater than what divides us. and that facing a common, in this case, unseen enemy, but a common enemy nonetheless, we have to create that sense of unity and bring something else to the table that is something that's much more tangible in terms of collaboration. So the subcommittee was actually founded because it's a subcommittee, I should mention, of the Aliyah and Klita, of the Immigration Committee and Absorption Committee. And very often in the Immigration and Absorption Committee, we discuss very important issues that have to do with really the integration of new immigrants to any country and to this country specifically, which we all acknowledge is difficult. In this country specifically, it brings with it a whole other set of challenges and opportunities. And again, with Corona and with everything else that COVID-19 brings with it, there's also apparently a wave of possible aliyah or immigration to the state of Israel. And that is important. And we need to pay a lot of attention to the barriers that exist and remove those barriers and expose them and be aware of them in order to enable integration. But at the same time, we very often forget about the engagement of the diasporas that don't intend to move to Israel, and the imperative to engage with those that live abroad, and the importance of learning and informing ourselves as we make decisions, by the way, as we make critical decisions for the state of Israel, that at the very least should be familiar with the challenges of Jewish communities around the world. That's not to say there's necessarily an institutional way of saying this, and there are different communities and different community representations and different challenges in each of the communities, of course. But for us to be decision makers sitting around the table in the state of Israel in this global reality without being aware of the challenges that each of the communities face around the world, we would be remiss to make those decisions. And that viewpoint diversity, as far as I'm concerned, is critical. And so the subcommittee is an opportunity to engage, and I welcome you as well to raise issues that come to us from the diaspora and that we want to engage with in terms of both the Knesset, the other MKs that would be able to, first of all, become aware and familiarized with, but also in terms of concrete solutions, concrete possibilities. And one of the things that happens in Knesset committees, and unfortunately, this is a less known fact, most of the work is done in the Knesset committees, not in the plenum, which if you watch, I apologize in advance, especially as we head into Yom Kippur. But the committees really do very, very important work. And some of the work that happens at the committees, and where I believe that it's important to have diaspora engaged, is that we have the various ministries around the table, in this case, around the Zoom table. And they are there to engage, but also very often hear for the first time from different perspectives their own challenges between interministries. And as surprising as it is sometimes, it's just about two ministries not knowing that there is an overlap, or that they're creating a barrier one for the other, and in this case, one for the other, and affecting diaspora communities. So that is the opportunity, and we will create a schedule that really brings subjects into the Knesset and subjects from the Knesset out to the external world, engaging with the communities. And I really encourage you, in whatever format you can make that accessible to us, to raise topics that are relevant to your communities, so that we can find a way to engage with them around the table in the Knesset and around this committee. And last but not least, as we struggle with one form of virus or another, we know that the virus of anti-Semitism, old and new converge, has found ways to manifest itself, to really, I would say, even creatively challenge us in ways we haven't known before. But really, when you sift out the new mediums that, whether it's digital platforms or things that we haven't been, I don't know if any of you were exposed to what's happening on TikTok with regards, for example, to Holocaust denial. When you sift through that, you realize it's the same old thing, just on a different platform. And we have tools that we should be using to address the same old thing once we've identified it's just using different platforms. So I'll refer a little bit perhaps to what happened in the Knesset committee hearing that you spoke of. It actually made its way around the world and had great exposure in the United States for many, many reasons. But I think the first reason is that it really touched upon something that challenges not only us, meaning not only Jews, and not only anti-Semitism, and we should not forget that, Because if you can't protect one minority, you can't protect any minority. And if you can't protect one group, you can't protect any group. And if you can't stand up for one country singled out and exposing double standards of those singling it out, then you won't be able to protect any country. And so in that engagement, and I'll maybe share a little bit of how that happened, there was a tweet on Twitter by a very well-known, personality in the UK. It was an anti-Semitic tweet, and it was on for a very long time in, digital platform time. Twitter's response was really very, very lacking, to say the least. As a result, there was a 48-hour initiative for a 48-hour blackout from Twitter, which I joined. Politicians and all kinds of, public personalities in the UK and beyond joined this 48-hour blackout. I'll say that for myself, I don't believe in boycotts. So I joined the 48-hour blackout in order to flag an issue, a real issue that I believe that Twitter, as all other platforms, has to begin addressing or continue addressing. As a result of the 48-hour blackout, we actually held a committee meeting at the Aliyah Klita committee, and Twitter engaged and Facebook engaged and Google engaged. And we had a very, you can watch it, it's a very short clip actually, a very, very raw experience with Twitter essentially exposing that according to its current policy, calls for genocide are okay on their platform, whilst political commentary by politicians in certain countries, and for me, it doesn't matter. I don't politicize and I don't personalize this. Certain political commentary by certain politicians in other countries is not okay. And that would be what they call flagged. And you would have to click through the content in order to be able to see the rest of it. So it is so raw. And, I encourage you to watch it, because it's a moment where I think it hit me that we have a real challenge here. And the challenge is as follows. The first, and I engaged with this in the discussion along with the digital platforms, is in order to address a problem, you have to define it. You cannot address any problem in any, capacity without defining it. And happily, we have a definition. And indeed, it was suggested and raised, and it will continue to be suggested and raised, that the IHRA working definition that's been adopted by over 30 countries be adopted by the digital platforms in order to understand what is anti-Semitism, in order to flag for themselves. Now, I want to say, and I say this as a free speech proponent, researcher, human rights advocate and champion. Free speech is a very important concern with regard to what happens with online content. And I would actually encourage, and I did encourage, digital platforms to engage with this in a completely different way than we currently have. Because the answer is not necessarily censorship. Censorship, with regards to censorship, my own stand is very clear. Whatever is illegal offline must be illegal online. It's actually, and for different countries, that looks a little bit differently, right? For America, it's clear and present danger. For Canada, it may be fighting words and incitement. What's illegal online should definitely be illegal. Offline should definitely be illegal online as well. But when it comes to the tremendous power and responsibility that comes with digital platforms, tremendous effect, global effect, it is a completely different conversation to be having with them. Is about education, the responsibility to educate. And they don't need to be the ones to educate either, right? In the case of IHRA, for example, there is an IHRA working definition for anti-Semitism. There are accepted definitions worldwide that all that needs to happen is, if it's algorithmically possible or technically possible for Twitter to flag something and for the user to have to click through, then presumably you can do the exact same thing and say, flag and click through if you'd like to know what the IHRA working definition for anti-Semitism says. And this happens to violate the IHRA working definition for anti-Semitism. And I want to say something else about the IHRA working definition. It's very important that we all sort of get our heads around it. It includes examples. It includes a neat little box of the definition for anti-Semitism, but the adopted statement, the IHRA working definition, includes the entire page, which includes very important examples, and you touched upon delegitimization, demonization, and double standards against the state of Israel. IHRA, without the 3 Ds, leaves us with not enough. with just not enough, because the new anti-Semitism that we see on and offline actually uses that ability to rename, to redub the Jew as the Zionist. That's all. We know it from campuses, we know it from online speech, we know it from what happens on the streets. And so the 3Ds are imperative, and as governments are called to task to adopt the whole definition, it's very important that they understand why that whole definition must include the exceptions. It's very important that the digital platforms are held to account to actually apply that transparent policy that they've put into place, including a definition, and to do so consistently with regard to all. And I'm going to come to a close. I just want to say about this. There is a wonderful initiative that's come actually as a result of those two hearings, and I hope that you'll hear about it shortly. And hopefully there will be, because this is a global challenge, there will be a global task force of interparliamentary work in order to engage with the platforms, in order to create some sort of a code of conduct that we expect of the digital platforms, because I think, again, with a global problem, it should be addressed globally and have global solutions. So I think with this, I'm going to come to a close. Those are sort of the three issues I wanted to raise, and I would love to engage in discussion with questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Michal. If I can just start with a subject you haven't really discussed, but we are all very interested in, coronavirus in Israel at the moment. We watch Israel, we become very distressed when we see what's going on there. I just wondered if you could give us some observations from your position in the Knesset about what's happening, and if there are any causes for optimism.
So I'll start by saying we're really in a state of emergency. I want that to be really, really clear at the get-go. And everything that I say should really emanate from that understanding. We are in a state of emergency. We're at about 7,000 new identified cases a day. The hospitals are not yet saturated, but some of them are close to it. I'd say the medical staff is saturated. And actually, they've just enlisted, there's an effort to enlist retirees, retired doctors and nurses, to enlist them to the effort. And so that's the first piece. The first piece is really the challenge. The second piece is how we've addressed the challenge. And you're asking this of me on a very difficult day, because we're about to pass all kinds of additional legislation or regulations that will affect a complete closure, a complete shutdown for the next 2 weeks, really with very, very few exceptions. And I want to share about this that, again, and maybe that's the optimist in me, the opportunities alongside the challenges for the state of Israel, the miracle that is the state of Israel at 72, is to shift the paradigm also with the way that decisions are made in terms of process, due process, in terms of governance, good governance, and in terms of planning, long-term planning. And I say this knowing that the state of Israel has never really had that luxury, right? We've been in survival mode for 72 years. And as a result of that, and I would say it affects the psyche of a people being in survival mode, but as a derivative of that, and I say this in the most depersonalized and depoliticized way that I can, as a derivative of that, we have never created proper long-term planning processes. We do not have transparency and accountability to the public that comes with that transparency. We don't even have that expectation to be able to make the information accessible, to indicate what the guiding logic for the decision-making is, and to share that with the public, even if the guiding logic changes because the numbers have changed. So my answer is very nuanced and it's very complicated. I think we're in a process, and I think that COVID-19 has presented us almost with alarm bells that we can no longer ignore. We cannot not listen to this shofar, if you will, at these 10 days of Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, in order to be able to continue sustainably I'd say the future tense of the state of Israel, the prospective look. There needs to be a paradigmal shift in the way we do things. I'm not even talking about the what, but rather about the how. That's where you find me really on a very difficult day for me. And I say this from within a very complicated unity government, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, how we've reached this situation. It's really complex. It's really complicated. And what I can add to the table, usually at every discussion and in every committee, is the imperative to depersonalize and to depoliticize these processes if we are to set ourselves on a track that looks different in the future. You know, around COVID-19, everybody keeps wanting to go back to routine. And I say, God forbid. God forbid we don't heed this call and don't recognize the opportunities and don't create new routines in whatever elements of our lives, private, national, peoplehood. We have so many opportunities. And I think that that's what COVID-19, you know, if I have to again be the optimist, is meant to really indicate to all of us and to the state of Israel. That's where we are. On a very practical level, we're about to shut down the entire country for the next 2 weeks with very, very few exceptions. I can tell you that the economic, obviously the health implications are dire. The economic implications are disastrous. And I want to touch on one more thing that isn't often touched upon. It involves Olim because they manifest this very well. When we have closure and we're told to be only with our nuclear families, and in a country of new immigrants that have no nuclear families to be with, where friends become the nuclear family and they cannot meet with them because that's what the health prescriptions require. Alongside the economic and alongside the health challenges and crises, and they are real crises, is also the societal, emotional crisis that is hitting the state of Israel. And that is going to have long-term manifestations, which we cannot anticipate yet. I see it at the various committees that I sit in. I see it at the committee that I chair with regard to substance abuse, in all kinds of ways that you wouldn't imagine. But substance abuse, for example, of any kind, from nicotine to alcohol, has risen dramatically. Teenage substance abuse has risen dramatically. When you think of the implications on a whole generation of teens that are both feeling the pressures of home, of unemployed parents not knowing where they're bringing food home from, and having no framework, no school. I mean, Zoom, with all due respect, maybe it works well in Australia, not so well in Israel. As part of our lack of long-term planning, maybe that's part of it too, but I don't think it works well for any teen to have to be on a computer screen rather than have that personal engagement. We really are and have to engage with those long-term challenges as well. And if I sound concerned, it's because I am.
Thank you. We all are very concerned, and we really hope that those with authority, with power, and with wisdom are able to do the right thing by everyone as soon as possible. But in the end of the 20th century, there was another virus we were all talking about, and that was a virus of racism and extremism. Two processes came out of that. One was the Stockholm process, which led to IRA and the IRA definition. There were wonderful conferences of governments, of world leaders coming together, looking at anti-Semitism and trying to do something about it. There was the other process which led to Durban, the United Nations World Conference Against Racism. And I remember being at both the government conference representing the Australian government, but also as together with a few interesting people such as Erwin Kotler of Canada, as part of the World Jewish Congress delegation at the NGO conference. And at the NGO conference, I think anybody who was concerned with anti-Semitism came out very bruised and battered. It was a dreadful experience. I just wondered, as we're now 19 years since the Durban conference, what lessons do you think people concerned with anti-Semitism and racism learned from that conference? Will we get it right if something like this comes around again?
So, you know, first of all, thank you for bringing up Durban. And I remember my father coming back from Durban, as you say, very bruised, very, very concerned. And I also remember very clearly, and I think maybe that's where my voice is very important with regards to the ICC as we address this next challenge. I remember very clearly that the state of Israel missed it completely. We didn't see it coming. We didn't understand, and maybe the rest of the world as well, but I can only take responsibility for my little neck of the world at the moment. We missed completely. And the launch of the BDS campaign as I would say, as a result of Durban, the launch of the BDS campaign also took our eye off the ball. We were so preoccupied with the BDS campaign that we didn't make the connection between the old and the new anti-Semitism as it was presented, as you felt when you were there, as those that walked away bruised understood so deeply that where the old and the new anti-Semitism converged was very much at Durban. That's where it happened. And that sense of I would say missed opportunity on one hand to identify what's happening there. And one more piece of it was actually the intersectionality piece that we missed completely. I like to say this, we invented intersectionality. It wasn't anything that should have been foreign to us, the ger and the yatom and the almanah. And we knew well that in order to advance justice, the cause of justice in the world, we have to ensure that we do it along with others. When we lost track of that, and this maybe I share, with all of us, not just Israel, when we lost track of that globally, whether it's on campuses or at community level, and lost the importance of interfaith collaboration and really reaching across divides and the importance of always having an eye to the other, we really I would say, walked into that battle that started at Durban with one or two hands tied behind our backs, because intersectionality was already at its almost peak, actually. It's where Black Lives Matter emerged from. It's where the Women's March in Washington emerged from. But those are just manifestations of many years of cultivation and hard labor, and we weren't there. We weren't there. We were in absentia. We weren't there for the discussions. I think in terms of lessons learned, the imperative to engage and to see reality as it is. And sometimes it's difficult. I had a very interesting conversation about using the IRA working definition more as a more legally binding definition. Sometimes, and that challenges us, right? Because it makes it about us. But it's very important that we understand that without engaging others on one hand, we can't protect ourselves. On the other hand, if we avoid engaging in that way, in protecting ourselves, for example, giving legal binding abilities to the IRA working definition, then we can't be there to protect others when the time comes. And that's a little bit loops back around to the ICC imperative. The ICC is not about Israel. It's not about specific soldiers or officers. The ICC is about its original mandate as its vision, mission, and values, stated vision, mission, and values with very little resources are meant to be carried out. And the preoccupation, I would say obsession, with the state of Israel at these institutions, and the fact that we don't call that double standard, and we as everybody, we as all of us, and in this I'm very clear, Israel cannot be left alone to expose the double standards, to understand the imperative to address the double standards. I would say it's where engagement with diaspora is probably at its peak. Speaking of opportunities, diaspora Jewish communities today, in that sense, are able to engage with their peers, with their counterparts of all faiths, in order to explain exactly that. The imperative of exposing the double standard, which showed up at Durban, exists today as well.
Yes, I must say at Durban, I had a great deal of pride being Australian, because the Australian government was a country which objected to the NGO report becoming part of the process, but also the Australian NGO community as a bloc refused to be part of the pile on Jews on Israel because there was just an understanding that it was the wrong thing to do. But you spoke about allies there, and a few years ago, there was an organization, the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism. Rabbi Michael Melchior, the Natan Sharansky dealt with it, and it moved to the Department Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there was a concept that anti-Semitism was not simply a Jewish problem, and you would recruit the best minds, the finest people, regardless of background or nationality, they would be involved in this massive campaign. But then it seemed to be less of an important issue on the Israeli government agenda and seemed to be falling back a little bit. I just wondered what the thinking might be of the current people within the Knesset and the leadership of Israel about building this sort of grand coalition and investing resources of Israel and supporters of Israel into this endeavor.
So I'll speak for myself. I think it's exactly what stands behind the initiative to create this interparliamentary task force, even if it's just one step in enabling, I would say, the resurgence of the global forum for combating anti-Semitism. I think it's no less necessary than before. And I certainly make it my mission to demand, or to at least ask to acknowledge of this growing need. And it actually hasn't decreased in any way. I would argue that it's increased. The need for it has only increased. And so what you see are derivatives of that. The reason that this ICC appointment is important is that. The reason that it's important that I was able to found the subcommittee for Israel diaspora relations was that, and in fact, the first committee hearing that we held was exactly about the topic of anti-Semitism on university campuses. The imperative to engage also, and I've actually been named also to the Foreign Affairs Committee, the imperative to engage with that at that level as well, because the state of Israel, and I say this again with humility, the state of Israel is really able to speak to the security elements always around the world. But until we understand that these issues are security, right? That foreign issues at the ICC with regards to combating anti-Semitism, with the imperative of the state of Israel to rise from the docket of the accused in every context, so that we can create sustainable, secure Israel into the future. That is something that I believe is still, we're still in the process of. I certainly am committed to bringing that voice to Knesset. It's what brings me here. And I'll maybe just say, it's what brings me here, not only as it's a mission. I mean, the sense of urgency that I feel with regard to COVID-19 actually transcends any and all of the issues that we've raised, that we're discussing here today. I feel that we are at a historic moment, junction, not only in Jewish history, and 72, you know, somewhere in our 70s, we always go a little astray, historically speaking, in the land of Israel, and with regards to our Jewish peoplehood story. And so that sense of urgency comes not only from that, the historical perspective, but really when I look at where we're at, you know, identifying the challenges that exist both in Israel internally and with regard vis-a-vis our discussion with diaspora Jewry as a people, and also with regard to the processes that, you know, we see internationally that affect the state of Israel, that intersect at places that challenge the state of Israel most. If I had to identify, including COVID-19, if I had to identify those intersections and say what challenges us as a country most, or what exposes our weaknesses most, it's exactly the challenges that we face now globally. Exactly those. And when you shine the spotlight in that way, then you understand my sense of urgency at sitting here and really viewing it as a mission, not as a job and not as a you know, part-time opportunity, but really as a mission to be able to advance this conversation that we're having now as far as we can take it.
Thank you. I was going to comment when you were speaking about parliamentarians, the wonderful organization, the Interparliamentary Committee Against Anti-Semitism, which produced the London Declaration, which many Australians have signed, but also had the Ottawa Conference, the Ottawa Declaration, where we saw the Australian delegates from across the benches, from across the floor, working together because this was an issue of concern to everybody. That was a great model. Now, although
Yes.
I have about 30 more questions I need to ask you, I'm now going to throw to the floor if I can, and I'll invite Naomi Levine to ask the first question, please. Naomi.
Hi, thanks very much, Michal. And speaking from Melbourne, where we've been in lockdown for about 7 or 8 weeks, we really do feel for you in Israel there. We know what you're going through. I wanted to speak to you about that, the social media side of things. And you mentioned the No Safe Space for Jew Hate campaign, and AJAC actually joined that. We also saw your discussions in the Knesset with the social media executives. What do you think is the reluctance from those social media executives to really make a change in this space? There doesn't seem to be a huge will to do it. What's holding them back, in your opinion?
So I'll say, first of all, I don't want to lump them all together. I think that they're each at a different place on their own journeys in understanding their responsibility and in understanding the tremendous responsibility that comes with the power they hold. I think, you know, depending on where they are in their processes. So I want to say that right at the get-go. I'll say something else about that. We have to be careful what we ask of them. And part of the reason for the Interparliamentary Task Force is actually that we have responsibility as well to hold them to account. And I just want to segue and say it's a completely bipartisan or non-partisan interparliamentary task force. It's very important that we understand that as well, because in many, many ways, it's not necessarily, and if you read Mark Zuckerberg's, he had an editorial piece about this. I don't want, as a free speech expert, about to submit a doctoral thesis on this, I don't want an algorithm or Mark Zuckerberg deciding what free speech is. I don't. And he doesn't either. I think that's part of the reluctance and the shying away we see. I don't want to attribute that to everybody. It just comes out very clearly in this article that he wrote. And I think that that's where we have, and that's the reasoning behind this interparliamentary task force is that we have a responsibility to address this issue, to create some sort of understanding of what it is that we expect of them. And it's not that there can be international regulation. Every country will have to regulate it in the way that it does, but it's not necessarily regulation that we expect. It may just be a code of ethics. It may just be a code of conduct. Because of the global nature of these platforms, and because it's important to hold them to account. And by the way, I think that that's where the public has a tremendous, tremendous power, right? Using these platforms, when you look at TikTok and that, terrible Holocaust denial game that they had of dressing up as Holocaust survivors and putting on makeup as Holocaust survivors, those are children engaging in Holocaust denial that don't even know what Holocaust denial is. They probably don't know what the Holocaust was. And so the tremendous responsibility is on us, the parliamentarians, on us world leaders, on us users of all these platforms to hold them to account and to say, there have to be some rules and regulations to this. It cannot be the wild, wild west. And we need to define those parameters where the balance between free speech and, as I said, really not necessarily censorship. If you asked me, I would use their power in order to educate. I think they hold tremendous power to educate. And when we know that billions of children around the world are being educated from what they consume online, then imagine what you can do with that if you find acceptable definitions. They don't need to be the ones to do it. Facebook doesn't have to have teachers. It just needs to refer out to the IHRA working definition. They need to refer out to all kinds of resources that are available that are internationally accepted definitions of history or of, things that might have happened in the past and children should be made aware of, or what, racism looks like today, or what Islamophobia looks like today. It really isn't singularly about neither Jews nor anti-Semitism. So thank you for that question. And I think we've got our work cut out for us.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Anthony Cohen in Loxdown, Melbourne, to ask your question, please, Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you, Michal, for your advocacy and your work. Look, anti-Semitism in Europe, from north to south, east to west, is virtually part of the DNA of the person from in the street to the hierarchy. It's somewhat similar, not exactly the same in the Arab world, but in the East Asia, sub-Indian continent part of the world, which is probably about 2/3 of the world's population, it's a relatively unknown concept. Is it possible to enlist the support of some countries in that region to assist in our struggle with this?
So first of all, excellent question. I think it's not only possible, but it's imperative to enlist. It's imperative that we engage the entire world on this. And I think we have that, again, the opportunities alongside the challenges in this global reality with these digital platforms that have reach around the world. This has tremendous potential to engage with all countries. And I want to say about Europe as well. And I want to say this carefully. I differentiate, the anti-Semitism you refer to from, and I need to differentiate it from the imperative to hold to account and at the very least expose double standards. I think that as recently as just a few weeks ago, when we're able to engage with European decision makers and indicate with data that money or funding coming from Europe was actually transferred to 3 murderers of Renat Schnerb, who was murdered a year ago, a 17-year-old girl in Jerusalem, then, and I'm not saying that, what drove them to this and if it was negligence or ignorance or intent. I'm not attributing any of those. The only thing that I do know is that we would be remiss not to hold them to account and, in fact, have them remove the funding, which they do, because at the end of the day, and this is where I believe that, as you say, the collaboration and the engagement with everyone is important. At the end of the day, what we need to channel, what we need to make clear is this is not about the Jew. It's not about Israel. This is about the Jew as the proverbial canary in the mine shaft. This is the next thing that happens is not Israel. The next thing that happens when we don't hold a terror regime of Iran to account is Khamenei actually is unleashed to engage in whatever he engages with, which is terrorism, towards the rest of the world. And the minute that we enable the double standard to exist, whether it's below the surface or above the surface, whether it's blatant or understated, it doesn't matter. The moment we don't hold to account, in many ways, we become complicit. In many ways, we enable the continued culture of impunity, whether if it's of a terror organization or a terror regime, or a European country funding terror activities without acknowledging that it is. And finally, I want to say one little last thing about the Arab countries that you mentioned. You know, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, you know, the peace or the potential real peace in the region with UAE, with Bahrain, maybe more countries to come. And I like to think of it as almost, well, as a paradigm shift, but as an end to what we know of historically as the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is huge. It's tectonic, right? It means that there are much more localized conflicts. The Israel-Palestinian conflict. Okay, that's a conflict. And the underlying assumption of that conflict being intractable, which relied on the Arab-Israeli conflict being intractable, it's gone. That underlying assumption isn't there anymore, because what's happened with this paradigm shift, as opposed to the three no's, no negotiation, no recognition, no peace, the shift here is yes. Yes, recognition. Yes, negotiation. Yes, peace. From that place, that's also a path forward with the Palestinians, with any peoples willing to engage with a very basic precept of challenging the paradigm that says you have to recognize the other side in order to engage with the other side. You can't come to any prosperity or peace arrangement sustainably, long-term or short-term, without recognizing their right to exist. So I think we'd be remiss if we miss that. And I think and I say that because I think there's an opportunity to engage with those countries and with those peoples as well, in order to address in advance anti-Semitism that actually isn't. It doesn't exist there. Not in UAE, not in Bahrain. It's very interesting. There is a real sense of interfaith collaboration that's growing. They're thirsty for it. And so I think that there's an opportunity there as well to engage.
Thank you. And I'd now like to invite Professor Greg Rose to ask your question. Please, Greg.
Thank you, Michal, for your time and words shared with us today. My question is a bit cheeky, and it's a personal request for a favor. In fact, I'm collaborating with some colleagues in relation to trying to address the very problems that you're referring to. I'm an academic, and a lot of the modern anti-Semitism, as you say, is present on campus. And most courses that teach about the Middle East conflict don't take a neutral line, but rather see Israel as engaging in criminal acts, particularly if they're international law courses. And so the proposal is to run courses on diplomacy, law, and security in Arab-Israel relations, with the first iteration of this being to the IDC to co-host with a group of Christian Zionist lawyers. And I'm very excited by the prospect of working with Christian Zionists, of whom there are so many, more than there are Jewish Zionists. And this is an organization based in The Hague, but there's huge potential in the United States, and there's huge potential, I think, if not in campuses, then off campuses in organizations around the world. And I'm wondering if maybe we could look to you for support in arranging things like, perhaps the idea is that the courses will be online, but supported by field trips in Israel to the Knesset and places of legal and security significance. And the most important target groups would be diplomats, particularly diplomats from developing countries who are engaged in national representation to the UN would be ideal candidates. And sponsorship of them to do the field trip in Israel would be invaluable. So I'm wondering if we can perhaps liaise with that after this, in relation to that, after this seminar, to look towards possible partnership and extension of this project.
Great.
100%. First of all, I want to say 100% we can liaise and 100% we'll set it up. And I look forward to engaging on this. It sounds like a tremendous idea. I already have a few things running in my head as you're speaking. I'm looking over at Becca, who is nodding her head because she knows some of the things that I'm thinking about. And I think that we can develop something very important in that area and really think it through and how to maximize that possibility. And I also thank you, because it's really a clear example of exactly the things that I'm talking about, exactly the type of initiatives. When I say intersectionality and when I say reaching across different, both faiths and countries, and really understanding and recognizing the opportunity alongside the challenge in this global reality that we live in, and taking into account a very real understanding of the challenges we face. And they are very real and they are very concrete. And I think that, first of all, I thank you. And I think that that exactly formulates one possible initiative, which I look forward to hearing and how I can collaborate on. And I also just want to mention, Greg, and I know that you backed the position that Australia made with regards to the submission regarding Palestine not being recognized as state at the ICC. And I think that those voices that are heard, and I applaud you for that. And I know that it has personal, professional, academic manifestations or implications that are not always pretty, to say the least, I know. So I just want to recognize that, because I think we often forget and we take into account, that we're all in it together, but we're all in it together, except it affects each of us differently. So I want to recognize the importance of that and look forward to engaging in a continued discussion on your idea.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Judy Maynard from Sydney to ask the next.
Yes, hello. Following on a little from that, last week, the United Nations singled out one country for condemnation regarding its policies on women, Israel. Numerous UN agencies continually propagate anti-Israel discrimination and vilification. So what can and should Israel and countries like Australia do about this?
So that's an excellent question. And there are moments where I understand many of my peers that make the decision not to engage because it's very overwhelming. And it really feels like it's one little drop in the sea. I just would argue that we have no alternative but to engage. And when I say engage, I mean call on the double standard over and over in every way possible. And I believe in every person being a change agent. I mean, I'm sitting at Knesset right now, but I could easily be somewhere else, whether it's in academia or in a, in an activist capacity that I was in as well, or as a lawyer. And I really think that it's very overwhelmingly troubling, except that herein lies the opportunity. It's very troubling to the entire world. It should be very troubling to the entire world. And it's up to each of our governments to become aware of the double standard that will affect ultimately our governments, or Canada or Australia, or I don't mean Israel when I say our governments, because it already affects Israel. But as I said before, Israel is the proverbial canary in the mine shaft, actually has to be the message that we find the way to distill. And by the way, it's where Israel needs diaspora jury, because the state of Israel doesn't always know how to make that accessible, that message to each government. It's where I look forward to engaging with my counterparts in different parliaments. But before that, I have to engage with the local Jewish community of that demography, because otherwise I won't have the tools in order to make what I'm saying accessible in a language that needs to be made accessible to the governments of those, or to the parliamentarians in those countries. And it's also where I think your voices are imperative, because it's not just, as I said, the state of Israel. It really is about all of our joint effort, not just for Jews, not just for Israel, really for justice. At the end of the day, a UN that singles out the state of Israel whether and victimize and vilifies Israel, whether it's with regard to women or with regards to any human rights violations or with regards to any of the issues that it consistently, institutionally singles Israel out for, it means that in fact, that is what enables the culture of impunity. That is what enables Iran to continue holding Nasrin Sotoudeh, who's been in a hunger strike for about 40 days in jail. It means that Raif Badawi, the Saudi Arabian blogger, is still a name that very few people are familiar with. And we have a responsibility to not only speak our own plight, we have a responsibility to speak the plight of others as well, as human rights concerns as well, because that's what enables us to expose the double standards, because that's what enables us to hold our governments to account when it comes to violations that will then harm us as well. So thank you for raising that. And at the end of the day, I have to say, it's a long, long road ahead of us. But we are accustomed to long journeys. We're a people that's traveled a long journey. And so we need to continue traveling it together. And that's where Israel diaspora relations, to me, are the most important piece that we can't lose. We just can't lose it.
Thank you. And with one more question we'll squeeze in, if you don't mind, before we conclude. Dr. Ran Porat from Melbourne. Ran, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Michal. It's nice to see Chavat Knesset talking to Australian Jewry. I just wanted also to mention Kylie Moore Gilbert is also imprisoned in Iran and maybe needs special attention from the international community. But my question is about the Israeli expats like myself that live across the world, including about 15,000 here in Australia. What specific and practical steps does the Israeli government take in order to tap into this population? And what role do you think Israelis should play vis-a-vis the state of Israel and the local Jewish communities?
It's such a good question. It's such a good question. And I think it's something, Ran, that we haven't been good enough at identifying yet. I think that former Israelis, or expats as you call them, that then are members of other communities in other countries and are able to engage, are another kind of bridge. If we're talking about bridges to bridges to bridges, I think that, you know, people like yourself that understand the reality on the ground, that oftentimes, you know, you say in Hebrew, a stranger wouldn't understand it. Oftentimes when you look at Israel from the outside world, you think, what is this country doing? And somebody who's an expat can almost, you know, it's actually, maybe sometimes it's harder for us, but can look in from the outside and explain and make it accessible to Jewish communities abroad. So I think you have a double role. I think you have a role, and all expats have a role both within your communities to convey, first of all, to engage. I want to start that. And if that's one word that comes out of today, it's to engage. And that also took a long process in many places. I mean, I lived in Montreal for many years. It was very difficult for Israeli expats to engage with the local community for many reasons, for religious, secular differences that we have in Israel and in across the world and so on. I think engagement is critical. And so I would say one role is the engagement with the local community on the ground. And the second run, and it's no less important, is the way that we have to find, and I look forward to continuing a discussion with you as well, and maybe please share my email so that we can continue all these discussions with everybody that's been raised. And maybe within the subcommittee, we should have a discussion run, and I would invite you to please join in for expats from around the world to engage with what is the role of your engagement with Israel, so that it could be a two-way relationship and not just you trying to, you know, keep up with the news, but not exactly having a role or a capacity of any kind. I think today of all times, the challenges are so big. And at the end of the day, if anything has been made clear by this COVID-19 is how it takes a network to beat a network. And we are a network. And we just have to sometimes reconnect all of the pieces in that network in order to function as a network. But there are so many possibilities for collaboration. I lost them. Oh no. Did I lose you?
No, I'm inviting Joel Burney to unmute, and please come in, Joel. No, Okay, it appears Joel's having a technical difficulty. But,
Is that working now, Jeremy? Is that
oh, you're
working
back.
now?
Thank you, Joel.
Yeah, sorry, Michal, I had a technical difficulty there. Apologies for that. Now, I just wanted to summarize the remaining questions that we had. Now, we've covered quite a lot. We've covered ICC, we've covered the UN, we've covered anti-Semitism, the new and the old. Lots of challenges there, but the overarching emotion that I got from the past 60 minutes, there's a lot of optimism in your voice. So before I conclude, I wanted to ask you the final question. Out of the challenges that we've discussed tonight, and noting that we're in the new year, we've celebrated Rosh Hashanah last week, we're in the new year, what is it that excites you about tackling specific challenges over the new year, over the next 12 months?
I think this discussion is what excites me. I think at the end of the day, this kind of engagement, the imperative to advance all the issues that we've talked about, whether it's Israel standing in the international arena or combating anti-Semitism, whether it's the ICC and the imperative for Israel to rise from the docket of the accused. I think that at the end of the day, what excites me the most is the opportunity and the responsibility to engage in this way and to bring representation or maybe viewpoint diversity to the table, to the decision-making table on this end, but also hopefully to affect decision-making tables around the world through these kinds of engagements. That's what makes me most hopeful at the end of the day. And I just want to take a moment just to wish Gmar Chatima Tova to everybody. It should be a healthy year. And really, I wish for all of us that we have the wisdom with courage and with humility to identify the many opportunities alongside the challenges that we face collectively and individually. And thank you for the opportunity to engage with you.
Toda Michal, on behalf of AJAC, Gmar Chatima Tova, to you and to our audience.